I thought I had it all figured out. The suburbs, with their perfectly trimmed hedges, HOA-approved mailboxes, and neighbors who gossip faster than a wildfire, had never felt like home. I craved space, peace, and something real. So I did what any sane person on the brink of insanity would do. I bought a farm, far enough outside the HOA's reach that I could finally breathe. The first morning I woke up on the farm, the sun spilling over acres of untamed land, I felt like I had stepped into a different world. The air smelled like earth and hay, not lawn fertilizer and stress. Chickens clucked like they were auditioning for Broadway in the barn, and my dog ran in circles as if he had discovered the meaning of life. I even had a little creek cutting through the property, the water sparkling in the morning light. My dream. My escape. But of course, dreams have a way of getting complicated when bureaucrats with too much time and too many rules find you. I was 3 days into farm life, mud up to my boots, face streaked with dirt, hands smelling of hay and chicken feed when the envelope arrived. Plain, white, official-looking. I picked it up from the mailbox, barely noticing the HOA logo staring at me with all the smugness of a cat knocking over a glass of water. My first thought, no way they even know about me. My second thought, well, let's see what ridiculous rule I've broken now. Opening it, my stomach sank a little. They wanted dues for a property they didn't even manage, and if I didn't pay, they threatened eviction. I stared at the paper like it was a horror movie poster. Eviction, I muttered to myself. I live 3 miles outside your borders. I reread the letter. Every word dripped with bureaucratic superiority. As per the community covenant, and failure to comply will result in enforcement action. There was a paragraph citing rules about landscaping and structural maintenance. I swear, it even referenced what color your mailbox should be. For my farm, that didn't even have a mailbox. I laughed out loud. My dog tilted his head like, should I be worried? I waved the letter at the chickens, who ignored me as usual. Look, ladies, they think they can boss me around from the suburbs. Can you believe this? But the humor didn't last long. Beneath the absurdity, there was something uncomfortable, something they hadn't counted on. I wasn't going to just roll over. This farm wasn't just land. It was my freedom, my sanity, and I wasn't about to let a group of clipboard-wielding, rule-obsessed people take it away. I spent the rest of the day packing through my fields, letter in hand, replaying the possibilities in my head. Could this escalate? Could they really try to evict someone who didn't live in their neighborhood? And if they did, how far would they go? My imagination went wild. I pictured a team of HOA inspectors marching down my driveway, clipboards in hand, measuring my fence posts like soldiers preparing for battle. By the time the sun began to dip behind the trees, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to let them intimidate me. If they wanted a fight, they had won. But first, I needed information. I needed to know exactly what they could and couldn't do. I needed a plan. And secretly, I wanted them to regret ever trying to reach beyond their little kingdom of lawns and tennis courts. That night, as I sat on my porch with the crickets singing and the creek whispering in the background, I felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. This was the life I had chosen, freedom and independence. But freedom has a price. Sometimes, that price comes in the form of white envelopes with HOA logos threatening eviction for property that isn't even theirs. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would start gathering facts. And maybe, just maybe, I would show these suburban rulers that some battles aren't won with petty rules. Some battles are won with determination, stubbornness, and a refusal to back down. And I wasn't backing down. The next morning, I woke up to the sun spilling over the farm again, birds squawking, and a lingering sense of dread. That white envelope from the HOA wasn't just a prank or a misdirected letter, it was serious. Apparently, the suburban kingdom I had so eagerly escaped considered me a trespasser, and according to their rules, trespassers owed dues. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat on the porch, and reread the letter. Every sentence seemed designed to make me question my sanity. Failure to remit payment will result in enforcement actions, including but not limited to eviction and legal proceedings. I laughed at the wording, but it was the kind of laugh that hides nervous energy. Who was running this thing anyway? I decided I needed a face to match the absurdity of the rules. A quick search of the HOA website revealed her, the president. Let's just say she was the poster child for self-righteous suburban authority. Mid-40s, perfect hair, nails that could slice paper, and a smile that looked friendly but was sharper than a cattle prod. I could imagine her sitting in her meticulously curated living room, sipping iced tea while drafting letters to offenders like me. I called her in my head Karen, because it just fit. Karen, the enforcer of perfect lawns, the keeper of the sacred mailbox covenant, the tyrant of Shrubbery Heights. I imagined her marching through the HOA streets, clipboard in hand, sunglasses reflecting her sense of superiority. Deciding not to wait, I drafted a reply email that morning. Polite, firm, but dripping with the kind of subtle sarcasm you only deploy when someone threatens your freedom. I told her that my property was outside their jurisdiction, I did not recognize their authority, and that any attempt to collect dues would be considered harassment. I pressed send and felt a rush of victory, like I had just thrown down the gauntlet. Of course, I didn't sleep well that night. My mind raced. What if they ignored my email? What if they actually tried to escalate this? I paced the barn, the chickens watching me like tiny judgmental HOA members, my dog at my heels. I even found myself muttering, "I'm not paying you a dime, Karen," in front of a stack of hay bales, as if the bales could form a jury in my favor. 3 days later, the response arrived. And oh, it was a masterpiece of suburban indignation. Karen had clearly spent hours drafting it, making sure to include every clause from the HOA handbook, every legal citation she could find, and a few personal digs about my unmaintained property. The letter basically accused me of flouting rules, disrespecting the community, and undermining the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. I sat on the porch, shaking my head. Aesthetic harmony, I whispered to myself. I had chickens roaming freely, a crooked barn, and muddy footprints everywhere, but apparently that was a crime. Then came the kicker. If I didn't pay the dues within 10 days, they would initiate eviction proceedings. 10 days. I stared at the letter like it was a ticking time bomb. My farm, my sanctuary, threatened by some overzealous suburban overlords. I spent the rest of the day walking the property, documenting everything just in case. I measured fences, took photos of the land, and even recorded short videos of my daily routines. Humor was my coping mechanism, and I narrated my life like it was a reality show. And here we see the rare and elusive HOA enforcer in her natural habitat, 3 miles away, plotting evil against an innocent farmer, I muttered, pointing at my chickens. By evening, I realized something crucial. I couldn't ignore this. If Karen and her HOA army really thought they could bully me into paying dues for land they didn't own, I would need a plan. Not just a sarcastic email or passive-aggressive muttering, but a real strategy. I didn't know the law, and I didn't know what tricks Karen would pull, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't go down without a fight. As the sun set behind the trees and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, I made a vow to myself. They would not take this farm. They would not steal my freedom. And whatever it took, I would stand my ground. Tomorrow, I promised myself, I would start gathering evidence, research property laws, understand the limits of HOA authority, and prepare for a battle that was just beginning. Little did I know, Karen had already started planning her next move, and it was going to be more audacious than I could have imagined. I spent the next morning packing through the fields with a notebook in one hand and my coffee in the other, determined to understand exactly what I was up against. This wasn't just a fight over a letter or a couple of silly dues. It was about my home, my sanctuary, and my right to live outside the iron grip of some suburban bureaucracy. First, I needed to know the facts, the boundaries, the rules, the limits of Karen's reach. I grabbed my tape measure and a GPS app on my phone and started marking property lines. Chickens flapped around me like tiny, judgmental supervisors. My dog ran circles through the fields, occasionally stopping to bark at imaginary HOA spies hiding in the trees. I laughed, but inside my mind was serious. I pulled out the HOA's handbook, downloaded from their overly polished website. It was like reading a book in another language, clauses upon clauses about landscaping, mailbox colors, fence heights, and even window treatments. Somewhere in the middle, they had a paragraph about sustaining neighborhood harmony through adherence to community standards. I had to read it twice. Sustaining harmony, I muttered. You mean controlling everything everyone does, within a 3-mile radius of your perfectly mowed lawns. I started cross-referencing every rule with my property. Fence, not even touching their boundary. Mailbox, I didn't have one. Landscaping, well, the trees, creek, and random patches of wildflowers might not win them awards, but they were mine. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Their rules didn't apply to me. Legally, I was untouchable. Emotionally, though, that didn't stop the chill that ran down my spine when I thought about Karen's persistence. I decided to go deeper. I contacted a local attorney specializing in property law. The conversation was brief but comforting. If your land isn't part of the HOA's jurisdiction, there's no legal basis for their dues or eviction, the lawyer said. They can't just reach outside their boundaries. I exhaled, feeling a little lighter, but also knowing that Karen wouldn't stop just because the law said so. Some people thrive on bureaucracy and intimidation, not logic. Next, I needed proof. I walked the property again, this time snapping photos of fences, boundaries, and even my adorable, mischievous chickens. I recorded a video of myself giving a little tour, narrating sarcastically for my own amusement. Here we have the wild and free farm, far, far away from HOA tyranny. Note the natural creek, completely unapproved by suburban standards. And over here, the chicken patrol, making sure no clipboard-wielding inspectors sneak in. My dog barked at the camera for emphasis, as if to say, yes, this is our domain. I also talked to a few neighbors, not HOA members, thankfully, who had seen similar ridiculousness from Karen's rule enforcement. They shared stories of fines over imaginary infractions, letters about non-existent violations, and emails dripping with condescending superiority. Humor kept creeping in even though the tension was real. The more I learned, the more I realized Karen had a pattern, and patterns meant predictability. Predictability meant opportunity. By mid-afternoon, I had my evidence folder filling up. Photos, videos, emails, and handwritten notes. I had mapped my property, documented the absurdity of their claims, and armed myself with knowledge. I even started drafting a timeline of every letter, email, and threat from the HOA. If it ever came to a legal battle, or even a showdown at one of their meetings, I would be ready. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wouldn't just accept facts. She thrived on conflict, and I had unintentionally become her new project. She wanted to exert control, and control is intoxicating when combined with an audience of neighbors eager to see justice served. I pictured her packing her pristine living room, shaking her perfectly manicured finger at a stack of papers, plotting her next move. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, I sat on the porch, sipping the last of my coffee. The farm was quiet, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Karen's next move was inevitable, and I had to be ready. I promised myself that when she came, I wouldn't flinch, I wouldn't back down, and I certainly wouldn't pay a single dime for her delusions of authority. Tomorrow, I told myself I would prepare for escalation. I didn't know what she would try next, but I knew one thing: I was ready for a fight. And this fight wasn't just about dues. It was about defending everything I had worked for, every peaceful sunrise, every muddy, every free-roaming chicken on my land. Little did I know, the next letter would push things farther than I expected, testing my patience, my humor, and my determination in ways I hadn't imagined. I thought I had a handle on things. I had researched the rules, mapped my property, and gathered enough evidence to fill a small filing cabinet. I even laughed at the idea that Karen and her HOA enforcers could intimidate me from 3 miles away. But then, the next letter arrived, and my confidence wavered. It wasn't just a letter this time, it was a declaration of war. The envelope was thicker, printed on heavy, with bolded words that practically screamed at me, "Final notice." I opened it, my hands trembling slightly, not out of fear but anticipation. The letter was dripping with bureaucracy and venom. Fines had increased, legal proceedings were threatened, and in an almost cinematic flourish, they claimed the right to take necessary measures to ensure compliance. I read it 3 times, then I laughed, loudly. My dog barked in protest, and the chickens scattered as if they understood the tension in the air. They actually think they can come after me, I muttered. For property they don't even control. I paced the yard, phone in hand, and called my neighbor for moral support. Did you see this? I said, waving the letter like a flag of defiance. They're threatening fines, eviction, and God knows what else. All for me living my life outside their perfect little bubble. My neighbor chuckled and reminded me that Karen had a history of escalating absurdly. Still, humor only goes so far when someone is officially threatening you. I realized that Karen wasn't just sending letters, she was trying to pressure me into submission. And she wasn't subtle. The next morning, a small van with the HOA logo appeared at the end of my driveway. I could just make out a couple of people, clipboards in hand, pretending to inspect the neighboring properties. Or maybe they were looking for me. Either way, it was a clear message: we are watching. I decided it was time to step up my defenses. I started compiling everything I had: property maps, photos of fences and fields, videos of the farm, copies of the letters and emails. I even created a little evidence board in my barn, pinning each threat and note to a corkboard, connecting them with red string like a detective in a crime drama. My dog wandered through, sniffing the strings, and my chickens roamed underfoot, apparently judging my organizational skills. I also began documenting my daily life as if I were preparing for a courtroom or a reality show. Every chore, every walk through the fields, every interaction with animals was recorded. This is Exhibit A, I joked to my phone camera, showing a muddy boot print in front of the barn. See, perfectly legal mud accumulation, right here on my property. But despite the humor, the tension was real. The letters had changed tone. They were no longer polite warnings. They were aggressive, demanding, and increasingly personal. Karen's obsession with my property was growing, and I knew she would stop at nothing. Her desire for control was intoxicating to her, and I was the one challenging it. One afternoon, I received an email that made my blood run cold. It was an invitation to a special HOA meeting to address non-compliance issues regarding your property. I stared at the screen. They wanted me to attend a meeting for property they didn't own, for rules that didn't apply to me. And yet, somehow, this was the next step in their escalation. I spent that evening packing the barn, imagining the meeting. Would they send inspectors, lawyers, drone cameras hovering over my fields? The suspense was unbearable, and I realized that the fight wasn't just legal, it was psychological. They wanted to unsettle me, make me question my choices, and maybe even scare me into paying dues or abandoning the farm. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood on my porch and took a deep breath. The farm was quiet again, but the storm was coming. I had a choice: back down and lose my freedom, or prepare for the next move in a battle that had only just begun. I knew I wouldn't back down. This was my land, my life, and my fight. Tomorrow, I would start planning my counterattack. Karen and her HOA might think they had power, but I was about to prove that sometimes freedom is worth defending with everything you've got. And I had a feeling that when the next letter came, or when the meeting happened, it would test me in ways I hadn't imagined. After the special meeting invitation landed in my inbox, I realized this was no longer just a matter of silly letters or over-the-top threats. Karen and her HOA had decided I was a project, a puzzle to solve, and their favorite solution was intimidation. But I had news for them. I don't scare easily, and I play to win. The first thing I did was gather all my evidence. Every photo of fences, every video of the farm, every email or letter from the HOA was organized into a binder that I proudly labeled The Karen Chronicles. I even color-coded the sections, because if I was going to fight this, I was going to be meticulous. Chickens wandered around my feet, pecking at the ground, seemingly judging my organizational skills, while my dog sat on the porch with the kind of expression that said, "Yep, you're officially obsessed now." Next, I called a local property attorney to discuss my options. I needed someone who understood HOA overreach and could guide me through this mess without costing me my sanity or my farm. After a brief consultation, I felt a little more confident. The lawyer confirmed what I already suspected. Karen had no legal authority over my property. But he warned, some people fight dirty. And Karen, I realized, thrived on control, drama, and paperwork. I decided it was time to turn their obsession into my advantage. If Karen wanted a battle, she would get one, but on my terms. I started documenting every interaction with the HOA. Every email, every phone call, every suspicious van outside my property was logged. I even set up a little video camera near the driveway, capturing any visitors who might be acting official. Humor became my armor. I narrated my videos like a documentary. Here we observe the suburban enforcer in her natural habitat, armed with clipboards and condescension. My dog barked for dramatic effect, and the chickens strutted past as if endorsing my narration. But I also had to be strategic. I researched the HOA rules, property law, and past cases of overreach. Every paragraph, every clause, every loophole became a weapon. I started drafting a response plan in my notebook, possible scenarios, responses, and contingencies. If they threatened fines, I would counter with legal precedent. If they tried to intimidate, I would record and document everything. If they came to the property, I would be ready to show them that I was untouchable. I also prepared mentally. Karen's letters were designed to provoke, to unsettle me. I practiced staying calm, keeping a neutral tone in all responses, and avoiding impulsive reactions. I knew that losing my temper would only give her the satisfaction of thinking she was winning. Humor and patience became my secret weapons. Still, there were moments of doubt. Walking through the farm, I imagined Karen and her minions arriving, clipboards in hand, ready to cite me for imaginary violations. The suspense was real. I shook my head and laughed at myself. If she really thought she could scare me off my own land, she clearly underestimated the stubbornness of someone who traded suburbia for a farm. By the end of the week, I had my plan: gather evidence, document everything, consult with legal counsel, and be prepared for any escalation. I even rehearsed my talking points for the special HOA meeting, imagining Karen's smug expression as I calmly dismantled every one of her claims. Humor helped me stay sane. I even made a little sign that read, "Welcome to the farm. Trespassers beware," armed with law and common sense. My dog seemed to approve, wagging his tail, while the chickens clucked in what I interpreted as a standing ovation. The suspense of the upcoming showdown hung over me like storm clouds. Karen thought she could intimidate me. She thought I would cower or pay up. But she didn't know me. I wasn't just fighting for a piece of land. I was defending my freedom, my sanity, and my right to live life on my own terms. As the sun set behind the trees, I stood on the porch, looking over my farm. The fields were calm, the creek sparkled, and the air smelled like promise. I took a deep breath and whispered to myself, "Bring it on, Karen. This farm is mine, and I'm ready for anything." Little did I know, the special meeting would bring surprises I hadn't anticipated, and the real battle was about to begin. The day of the special HOA meeting arrived, and I wasn't sure what to expect. My nerves buzzed like the flies around the barn in the summer heat, but my determination was stronger than ever. I had gathered evidence, studied the rules, and mentally prepared myself for whatever Karen and her team could throw at me. Still, there was a part of me that wondered if this was going to be more dramatic than I imagined. I arrived early, notebook in hand, camera ready, and a thermos of coffee because, let's face it, surviving a meeting like this required fuel. Across the table, Karen and her board members sat in their pristine, air-conditioned conference room, looking exactly like I had imagined. Perfect hair, suits pressed so sharply you could cut yourself, and smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. She looked at me with that combination of confidence and smugness that said, "I'm in charge here, and you're the problem." The meeting began with pleasantries that felt like knives in slow motion. "We're here to address the concerns regarding your property and compliance with the HOA rules," Karen said, her voice dripping with superiority. I nodded politely, letting her think she had the upper hand for now. Then came the accusations. "Your property is causing disruption to neighborhood aesthetics," Karen said, tapping her clipboard. "Your fencing is not in line with community standards, and your landscaping is unconventional." I tried not to laugh, but a small snort escaped. Unconventional. My fence is 3 miles outside your jurisdiction, Karen. I calmly presented my evidence. Maps showing the property lines, photos of the farm, a timeline of every letter and email. I even had videos of daily life on the farm, narrated for dramatic effect. Here we see the rare suburban bureaucrat trying to enforce rules on land they do not own. Observe the chickens, undisturbed by their threats. My dog barked in the background at the perfect moment, and I swear it punctuated my point better than any slide could. Karen's expression shifted from smugness to irritation. This does not change the fact that you are expected to comply with community standards, she said. I tilted my head and smiled. Actually, it does, I replied, voice calm but firm. According to property records, my land is outside your jurisdiction. The rules you're citing apply to the HOA properties, not mine. Any enforcement attempt on your part would be considered harassment and potentially illegal. A murmur ran through the room. Karen's team shuffled papers, looking for anything to counter my points. I could feel the suspense building, like the calm before a storm. For a moment, the air was tense, thick with anticipation. Would she try some last-ditch intimidation tactic, or would she realize she had overstepped? Karen leaned forward, her voice sharper now. We have residents concerned about the view and the general community harmony. Your property is negatively impacting the neighborhood. I smiled wider. You mean my property doesn't match the perfectly trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes across the street? I'm sorry if my chickens and creek offend anyone, but that doesn't give you legal authority over me. I could see her frustration mounting. Every time she tried to bring up violations, I had evidence ready to refute it. Every citation she pointed to had been carefully documented to show it didn't apply to my land. Humor and calmness became my armor, and I could see it getting under her skin. By the end of the meeting, Karen had no legal ground, and her attempts at intimidation were exposed as nothing more than bluster. I left the room feeling victorious, but the tension lingered. The HOA hadn't given up yet, I could feel it. There was one final, subtle challenge, a warning that this wouldn't be the last communication. A twist, waiting in the shadows, ready to escalate further. As I drove back to my farm, I looked out over the fields, feeling a mix of triumph and anticipation. I had survived the confrontation, defended my property, and exposed the overreach of Karen's HOA. But the real battle wasn't over yet. I knew there would be another letter, another attempt, maybe even a new tactic designed to rattle me. I pulled into the driveway, my dog jumping from the passenger seat, and the chickens scattering in their usual chaotic welcome. I took a deep breath. The farm was safe for now, but Karen's obsession with control was far from finished. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would prepare for the next move. And this time, I would make sure the HOA realized that the more they pushed, the stronger my resolve became. The suspense was far from over. After the meeting, I knew one thing for sure: Karen wasn't going to give up. If anything, the confrontation had fueled her obsession. But instead of fear, I felt something stronger: determination. I wasn't just defending my property anymore, I was preparing to flip the script, to turn this absurd battle on its head. The first step was strategy. I reviewed all my evidence again: property records, maps, photos, videos, and the timeline of letters and threats. I looked for patterns in Karen's behavior. Every time she tried to intimidate, she left a trail: emails, public complaints, overzealous citations. Patterns meant predictability, and predictability meant opportunity. I started with the emails. There were dozens, all carefully cataloged. Some were threatening, some passive-aggressive, and some outright comical. Your landscaping is unacceptable, one read. Your mailbox disrupts the visual harmony, said another. I couldn't help laughing at the absurdity. My mailbox wasn't even visible from the nearest HOA property, and my landscaping, well, let's just say it had personality. Next, I dug deeper into public records. It turns out Karen's HOA had made a few mistakes themselves over the years, violations they had never enforced, properties that didn't comply with their own rules. Jackpot. I compiled the evidence carefully, documenting every oversight. Suddenly, I wasn't just defending myself, I had leverage. Then came the fun part, public awareness. I reached out to a local community newsletter, framing the story carefully, not as a complaint, but as an example of bureaucracy gone wild. Photos of my farm, the chickens, the creek, the pristine boundaries contrasted with Karen's obsessive enforcement, all highlighted the absurdity. Humor and facts together became a powerful combination. The suspense mounted as I waited. Karen couldn't ignore this attention, and I knew she would respond. Sure enough, within days, another letter arrived. This time it was more aggressive, but there was a hint of hesitation in the tone. I could almost feel her frustration leaking through the text. She was used to compliance, not pushback. I decided to escalate carefully but strategically. I responded calmly, citing legal precedents, pointing out HOA overreach, and subtly highlighting their own inconsistencies. Every word was deliberate, every point documented. Humor threaded through the message, not sarcastic, but clever, highlighting the ridiculousness without losing credibility. Then came the moment of truth. Karen scheduled a follow-up meeting, clearly intending to intimidate me further. But this time I was ready. I brought all my documentation in organized binders, my evidence carefully annotated. I even prepared a visual presentation, a map of my property lines, photos of the farm, videos of daily life, and a side-by-side comparison of HOA enforcement missteps. My dog sat nearby, my loyal companion, as if to remind everyone in the room who really ruled this land. The meeting began, and Karen immediately tried to regain control. "We have residents concerned about your property," she said, pointing to a stack of letters I had already countered. I smiled politely. "Actually, I've reviewed each of these letters and cross-referenced them with property records and HOA enforcement history," I said calmly, clicking through my presentation. "It seems the concerns are based on rules that don't apply to my property. And interestingly, there are several HOA properties that have violated these same rules without consequence." The room went silent. Karen's expression faltered. Her carefully rehearsed arguments were crumbling. Every time she tried to assert authority, I countered with documented facts. The suspense was almost unbearable. Would she retreat, escalate further, or try a last-ditch intimidation tactic? And then it happened. Karen's voice wavered. She realized she had no legal ground, no moral high road, and no public support. She had underestimated me, and the tide had turned completely. I wasn't just defending myself anymore, I was leading the narrative, and the HOA had no choice but to follow. As I walked out of that meeting, victorious but wary, I couldn't help but laugh. Karen had tried to push me, intimidate me, and bully me into submission. But instead, I had turned the tables, showing that knowledge, preparation, and a touch of humor could overcome even the most absurd bureaucracy. The farm was safe, my freedom intact, and Karen, well, let's just say she had a lot to think about. Tomorrow, I told myself, would be the final step, the resolution, the victory, and the moment where the dust settles. But I also knew that freedom isn't just given, it's defended, fought for, and sometimes, you have to make sure your opponent knows exactly who they're dealing with. Little did Karen know, the best was yet to come. The morning after the follow-up meeting, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The tension that had been building for months, the letters, the threats, the relentless bureaucracy was finally starting to dissipate. My farm was mine, my freedom intact, and for once, the chickens seemed to strut with a little more confidence, as if they sensed the change in the air. But of course, I didn't take anything for granted. Karen might have faltered in the meeting, but bureaucrats are persistent creatures. I spent the morning reviewing the final communications from the HOA, making sure every point was documented and every claim disproven. By now, I had a mountain of evidence that clearly showed they had no jurisdiction over my property, and any attempt to continue enforcement would expose them to legal consequences. As I sipped my coffee on the porch, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. This farm wasn't just land or a property investment. It was my sanctuary, my escape, my sanctuary from a world obsessed with conformity. And for months, Karen had tried to turn it into a battlefield. She underestimated me, underestimated my patience, and most importantly, underestimated my stubbornness. Later that afternoon, an official email arrived from the HOA. I almost didn't dare open it, but curiosity won. The subject line read, "Resolution of compliance issues." I clicked. The email was short, polite, and most importantly, final. The HOA acknowledged that my property was outside their jurisdiction, that no dues were owed, and that any further attempts to enforce rules would be considered harassment. In other words, I had won. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with preparation, humor, documentation, and steadfast persistence. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a triumphant laugh. My dog barked in agreement, and the chickens scattered in excitement, or maybe confusion. Either way, it felt like a celebration. I had faced the absurdity of bureaucratic obsession and come out on top. But victory wasn't just about the letter. It was about the process, the struggle, and the satisfaction of standing my ground. I thought back to the first envelope from Karen, that ridiculous demand for dues on property she didn't even manage. At the time, it had felt threatening and intimidating. Now it was almost comical. The audacity, the meticulous attention to irrelevant details, the belief that she could control what wasn't hers, all of it had been dismantled. I spent the next few days walking through the farm, enjoying the quiet that had been hard-won. I watched the chickens peck at the ground without fear, my dog running through the fields, and the creek glinting in the sunlight. Every muddy footprint, every crooked fence post, every wildflower patch felt like a small victory. This land was mine, and I had fought for it. Humor still lingered in the background. I imagined Karen packing her living room, tapping her clipboard, realizing that all her efforts had amounted to nothing. It wasn't revenge, exactly. It was the satisfaction of knowing that knowledge, preparation, and a little stubbornness could outmatch bureaucracy and ego. As the sun set behind the trees, I stood on the porch, looking out over the farm, feeling a mix of relief and pride. Freedom isn't something you get handed, it's something you defend. Every letter, every meeting, every tense moment had been a battle, but the reward was more than worth it. I had reclaimed my sanctuary, protected my way of life, and proven that even the most absurd threats can be overcome with determination. I leaned back, letting the evening air wash over me, and whispered to myself, "This farm, these fields, these animals, they're mine, and no one is taking them away." The fight with the HOA had ended, but the lesson remained. Stand your ground, know your rights, and don't let absurdity intimidate you. And sometimes, just sometimes, a little humor and stubbornness is all you need to win. As the stars appeared in the sky, I smiled, imagining the peaceful days ahead. The farm was quiet again, the chickens settling in for the night, my dog resting at my feet, and for the first time in months, the word freedom felt real. Karen might still be out there, obsessively trimming hedges and measuring mailboxes, but this farm was untouchable. And in that moment, I knew I had fought the bureaucracy and I had won. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.